Well, good afternoon once more, everybody. It's absolutely splendid that you can all be with us from all different parts of the world. Today, for example, I'm signing in from the Highlands, where it is alternately sunny, sleet, snow, wind, and rain. There's no fog, but just about every other aspect of weather you could possibly imagine, which is really rather exciting. And it really is a great pleasure to welcome our author for today, who has written this fine book, which I have in front of me, Being and Dwelling Through Tourism, an Anthropological Perspective. Catherine Palmer is an academic from the University of Brighton, and the reviewer is Noel Salazar, who has a chair in anthropology and in Belgium, and also is very well known internationally, not only through his academic work, but also through his great contribution to international associations such as IASA and the IUAES, the International Union for Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences. And indeed, I would encourage all attendees as well to become involved in those absolutely marvelous associations which do so much to enrich the life of we anthropologists really everywhere in the world. Well, I think that's quite enough from me. The normal running event for the today is that the author speaks for all about their book, and then the reviewer begins to dialogue, and then finally we turn out to the audience. Final little point I should say is that there is a discount code available to purchase this book, and further information will be circulated to all participants in due course, and so that they can actually acquire it. So thank you very much indeed, and I turn the floor over now to Catherine Palmer, who will tell us what she was about when she wrote the book. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David, and hello everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank the RAI for inviting me to take part in the event, and thank you to David for chairing and to Haneen for organising everything. And of course, there's a big thank you to Noel for taking the time to do the review and for agreeing to take part today. I actually wrote the book several years ago. And so actually looking back on it now with this event has given me a time to revisit it and reflect on my thinking. And it's a bit like going back and rereading your PhD and seeing all the things that in hindsight you would change. But it has been a very useful experience for me. By way of introducing the book, I'd just like to provide some context. As David said, I'm at the University of Brighton. I'm actually a visiting research fellow attached to the Centre for Memory, Narrative and Histories at Brighton. But prior to becoming a visiting fellow, I worked at the university for around 30 years, teaching and researching tourism anthropology. So my interest in tourism, in tourists and destinations goes back a long way. I've also spent many years working closely with Brighton colleagues and PhD students in arts and humanities, history, memory studies, media and arts practice. And this experience was and still is hugely influential. And it also gave me a really useful sort of discussion forum, if you like, for thinking through some of the ideas in this book. I could talk them through with colleagues. While my interest in tourism is long-standing, it is not solely intellectual. Like many people, indeed many anthropologists, I'm also a tourist. I go on weekends away and on longer holidays. I've stayed in hotels, apartments, ski chalets, bed and breakfast places. Although I have to say I've always drawn the line at camping. I've watched cultural displays for tourists. I've visited heritage sites, gardens, museums and galleries. I go to the beach, I sunbathe, I eat ice cream. I take photographs, I buy souvenirs, many of questionable taste. And on impulse, I buy drinks in duty-free I've enjoyed on holiday that I wish I hadn't when I get back home. In days gone by, I would write and send postcards, which usually arrived after I returned home. I've encountered the familiar in faraway places and the unfamiliar when holidaying at home. I've had flights delayed and lost luggage. I've been a victim of theft and been searched by airport security. And all the while, anthropology has travelled with me. Because when being a tourist, it is impossible, well for me anyway, to leave anthropology behind, to stop myself from watching what goes on and wondering what it might tell us about the part tourism plays in people's lives and livelihoods. Clearly, I do manage to switch off. I'm not quite as sad and boring as that makes me sound. But I've been thinking about tourism, destinations, the people who work in tourism for a very long time. Indeed, tourism is a part of many people's lives, which is not to say that everyone engaged in or with tourism has the same positive experience of tourism, because clearly they do not. And when writing the book, a lot of the realities about tourism were always in my mind, though they weren't the primary focus of this particular book. So the book is not just based on thinking about tourism, and by thinking, I mean bringing something to the surface. It's also based on asking questions of myself, some of which I've addressed elsewhere through writing about tourism in terms of colonialism, stalking the cannibals, identity, myths and symbols, and so on. But outside of these particularities, I've been toying with a bigger overarching question, one that finally made me put pen to paper, or actually fingers to the keyboard, and write this book. What does the activity of tourism tell us about the lived experience of being human, the experience of being alive, as the title of Tim Ingold's book is, which I'm sure many of you have heard about? For me, this question required a wider conceptual framework, and it was evident in much of the existing literature, including my own, seeking to explore and make sense of tourism by focusing on specifics such as visuality, identity, mobility, myth-making, or tourism as a form of globalised consumption. So while I was not using the book to propose a grand theory of everything, tourism as human experience is far too complex and multifaceted to be tied down in such a way, I was looking for a more holistic understanding of tourism. In the end, it was one of Ingold's other books, The Perception of the Environment, that inspired me to respond to my big question by bringing philosophy into conversation with anthropology. Specifically, Ingold's focus on dwelling as a way of being in the world, being engaged in a world that is familiar, that is lived in and experienced on a daily basis, seemed to me to be a particularly useful way of thinking through tourism, because tourism is a well-established human activity, as opposed to something separate to our outside of everyday life. A focus on dwelling as a way of being human in the world enables tourism to be located within the totality of life and of living. Within this totality, concepts such as tourist gaze, tourism abilities, identity, pilgrimage, and so on are all aspects of being and dwelling through tourism because they are part of the experience of life. Ingold led me to the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, because Ingold's dwelling perspective draws from Heidegger's writings on the subject, in particular Heidegger's essay for the 1950s, Building Dwelling Thinking. And I'd also highlight another one of Heidegger's books, Poetry, Language, Thought, which includes lots of other essays written by Heidegger, which I also used quite extensively in the book. While Heidegger is an important driving force behind my ideas, he is not the only philosopher I draw from in the book. For example, I talk about tourism as revealing what Husserl refers to as the life world, a world that is familiar, that is lived in and experienced on a daily basis, and from which knowledge, meaning, and understanding emerge through involvement with human and non-human others. I found Dewey similarly enlightening, with a timely reminder that, and I quote, "It's not experience which is experienced, but nature. Stones, plants, animals, diseases, health, temperature, electricity," and so on. The contemporary philosopher Alain de Botton's writings on the relevance of philosophy for everyday life were also influential, giving that involvement with others, with everyday life, encompasses all that humans do across the broad spectrum of the life world, from hunting for food, weaving cloth, growing crops, to driving a car, building a house, and going on holiday. Nevertheless, it is Heidegger who provides the key framing for the book. It's important to say here that my use of Heidegger is selective and contextualized within my anthropological approach to understanding human experience. This book is not a philosophical interrogation of Heidegger. Others are more qualified than I to do so. I am not by training a philosopher, and therefore, I didn't even attempt to do a philosophical reading of Heidegger. Nor does the book engage with debates about the metaphysics of reality or truth. This is not the type of philosophizing I wanted to engage in, because to do so would be to separate tourism from its moorings and set it adrift in a sea of mystery, divorced from the very thing that gives it meaning and purpose, life as it is lived, as it is experienced by people. So in the book, I use Heidegger as the starting point from which to fashion an anthropological interrogation of tourism in order to think through what dwelling through tourism might reveal about the experience of being human, the experience of being alive. It's worth stating at this point that Heidegger is not an easy read. He's not bedtime reading, and I do not claim to understand everything he is trying to say. Indeed, one critic of Heidegger described his writing as the translation of meaningless German into meaningless English, which I found rather reassuring. And when I started the book, I was heartened by Ingold's admission that he did not read all of Heidegger's work, because according to Ingold, people who read too much Heidegger cannot write properly anymore. And I hope that doesn't apply to my book. Despite such criticisms, I am inspired by Heidegger. He's important, he does have something interesting to say. For example, in Heidegger's concept of being in the world is not a specific place as such, but indicative of a holistic relationship with familiar everydayness, a relationship he describes in terms of dwelling. Dwelling is not about staying put, staying still. For example, tribal societies whose whole way of life is spent following the herd or moving from place to find food, or in time with the seasons, is dwelling through moving. And while dwelling is not a comfortable experience for everyone, it is indicative of how people become to be who they are through an active and practical involvement with human and non-human others. To be involved in a familiar everyday world is to be engaged with people, with the things and activities from which a meaningful life is made, and through which an individual is able to find their place in the world. Activities such as tourism, and the range of experiences associated with it, going on holiday, visiting museums, attractions, day trips to places of interest, climbing, walking, painting, and so on. In this sense, tourism matters, not just as a source of pleasure or as a source of income, but as a reference point for who we, you, me, or how you, me, a reference point for how we, you, me came to be who we are. So the book may draw on philosophy. I may describe my approach as philosophical, but it is an approach firmly rooted in the sort of activities and experiences associated with being a tourist. Now, I'd just like to move on and give a flavour of each chapter, because clearly I can't go through all the arguments in the book. So I'm just setting out a few of them, the main arguments and some of my thinking. It's clearly impossible to include everything to do with tourism and all the things that tourists do. So I decided to focus on some of the foundational elements of dwelling, rather than every possible way in which being and dwelling through tourism can be examined, which gives Noel lots of opportunity to highlight all the things that I've missed. The chapters are organised thematically: sensuous dwelling, architectural dwelling, earthly dwelling, and each chapter begins with a discussion of the overarching theoretical framework, followed by an illustrative focus on specific aspects or aspect of tourism. Although each chapter focuses on a different theme, this does not mean there is a neat dividing line between each chapter. For example, chapter 2's theme of sensuous dwelling focuses on the role of the body and embodiment in tourism. But clearly, the body of the tourist visits Hever Castle, as discussed in chapter 3. The body of the tourist also uses airports and takes day trips to museums, the focus of chapters 4 and 5. Looking back now, I would include a chapter on virtual dwelling, on how individuals conceive, understand, and encounter self and world through technologically mediated experiences of tourism. I hope to address this through a future publication. Likewise, if I was writing the book now, I would dedicate a chapter to the natural world, including animals. Although there are numerous discussions of animals and nature in the book, these are part of chapters primarily focusing on other aspects of tourism. So just to give a very condensed summary of each chapter, chapter 1 discusses in more detail a lot of the issues I've just introduced. And following on from that, chapter 2 focuses on what I refer to as sensuous dwelling, the intimacy of being that results from the coming together of body, mind, and senses. Sensuous dwelling is an exploration of embodied practices, such as moving, thinking, feeling, and doing. Practices that create and are played out in a variety of social contexts, including the social context of tourism. Tourism and being a tourist are associated with specific activities, practices, and behaviours, which coalesce to form a tourist habitus, an embodied history of how to behave as a tourist, reinforced by the reactions of other tourists that is the correct way to be a tourist. The specific examples that I discuss in the chapter are walking and sightseeing, which are among the most obvious tourist activities, and the ones by which someone is recognised as being a tourist. I do not argue that every tourist body engages with these activities in the same way, as different cultures and belief systems influence how bodies become a tourist. But I do think there is always a recognisable tourist habitus behind how tourists move and how they look. Japanese tourists do not always look in the same way as North American tourists. Each are influenced by a different social and cultural environment. Although walking and sightseeing offer most, but not all people, routine activities of daily life, they are not understood as being particularly significant in the same way as they are when associated with tourism. Through tourism, walking and seeing are made significant because they are advertised as the means by which to uncover and discover people, places, things, and ideas not normally encountered as part of everyday life. Tourism transforms them by making them visible in the sense of being noticed, and as such, seeing becomes sightseeing, and a walker is turned into an explorer. I then move on from embodied sensuous dwelling to how being and dwelling is intertwined with materiality. Material dwelling concerns the ways in which objects and the settings in which they are to be found are put to use, how they are employed to construct, or rather gather together, a meaningful world, and in so doing create and reinforce the fundamental values that define what matters in that world. In this chapter, I explore what kind of dwelling world is created through the gathering capacity of heritage materiality, heritage tourism, if you like. What does this gathering build? How do tourists experience that which is built? And what thinking occurs as a result? So I'm not analysing objects per se, I'm analysing the setting in which those objects are placed, which is all part of heritage tourism. The illustrative example I use is Hever Castle in England, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, one of the 6 wives of King Henry VIII. It was the relationship between Anne and Henry that led to the English Reformation, a hugely significant event in English history, rewriting the relationship between church and state by breaking away from Rome and the authority of the Pope and enshrining Protestantism as the nation's official faith, referred to then and still today as the Church of England. Hever Castle illustrates how the objects, buildings, and landscapes of heritage are gathered together and used to create a world that is essentially English, Protestant, and where individual liberty is a defining characteristic of the English nation, English identity. Overall, the chapter argues that heritage materiality reworks the past as the experience of time, specifically an experience of what I refer to as heritage time. Heritage time is a combination of everyday social time, the time of heritage professionals, and the time of historians, a temporal narrative of personal and collective identity that is selective, partial, and open to interpretation. Nevertheless, heritage time is important because it illustrates the human need to create ways of locating the self within a wider temporality of events, in effect to establish, maintain, and perpetuate the lineage of human existence. Dwelling through the materiality of heritage time, as illustrated by Hever Castle, provides reassurance that there will be a future me, as well as a collective we. Following on from heritage tourism, the chapter moves from things per se to explore how the thinking and making function of architecture is a way of organising, knowing, and describing the world. Buildings, structures, and landscapes are creations of a process of imagining that I refer to as architectural dwelling. a way of being human in the world based on the interweaving strands that connect architecture with human behaviour. Architecture is in effect the outer skin of a society, but it is an enchanted skin, enchanted by the techniques and aesthetics of building and interior design, and in terms of the opportunity it gives to glimpse what lies beneath the surface, the values and beliefs underpinning what has been built. The buildings and structures used by tourists, the hotels, shopping arcades, gardens and attractions, provide opportunities for encountering the social and economic relationships of the society in which they are located. Architecture plays a significant role in attracting and structuring the tourist experience. And by way of illustration, I focus on airports, asking myself, what does airport architecture tell us about being human through dwelling? What does it make visible? Despite the huge variety of airports that exist throughout the world, from small local terminals to regional hubs and grand international gateways, they all serve the same foundational purpose: to move people from ground to air, and then through the air from one place to the next. They all offer a similar range of experiences and services, such as shopping, eating, and drinking. Not always to the same scale, because there are huge differences between what is offered at an international airport and what is available at an airport consisting of a runway and a hut for a terminal. Despite such differences, checking in, boarding, departing, arriving are what all airports do, and it's all facilitated by airport architecture. Airports are a special case because waiting for a flight and flying disrupt time and space, creating a suspended being betwixt and between one place and the next. Air travel means that individuals are actually suspended in the air. They leave terra firma physically and emotionally to travel in and through the air. And this opens up an understanding of what it is to be human that is different to other forms of transport. In flight, we see our separation from the earth, separation from that which defines us as humans. We are dwellers on, not above the earth. Airport architecture provides time-space intervals of distraction, such as shopping, that gradually accustom an individual to the experience of being out of place. Airport shopping is a distraction. I shop because I am waiting for what is to come. And the what is to come involves leaving the ground, leaving the environmental conditions that support human life for ones that endanger life in a very real sense. Ships have lifeboats, planes do not. I argue that airports are designed to create a unique sense of place, one that articulates a relationship between people, place, and cosmos. In this sense, airports are sacred buildings because, like churches, temples, and mosques, they are physical manifestations of the border between life and death. Following on from architectural dwelling, the next chapter adopts a more holistic approach, which I refer to as earthly dwelling, to focus on the significance of the human-earth relationship. In this sense, earthly dwelling is inseparable from the non-human environment, since being human is very much a being deeply embedded in a world shaped by animals, plants, spirits, and so on. This chapter focuses on what, for me, are the primary meaning-making reference through which this relationship is understood, namely time, place, history, and memory, collectively referred to, or I refer to them collectively as the tourism fourfold. My fourfold is clearly inspired by Heidegger's fourfold of earth, sky, divinities, and mortals, which he employs to illustrate the relational totality of human existence. Like Heidegger, I'm not interested in what each element of my tourism fourfold may or may not mean individually, but in their inseparability, because these four are ways of classifying, explaining, and knowing the world. They are also woven into the experience of tourism, because engaging in tourism is to engage with particular configurations of time, place, history, and memory, configurations that are marketed as dark tourism, heritage tourism, adventure tourism, and so on. So visiting a museum provides the illustrative example because museums gather together time, place, history, and memory and rework them as stories reflective of a particular worldview. Whether the museum in question focuses on art and design, archaeological remains, transport or warfare, whether it displays the history of scientific or technological innovation or the history of theatre. All museums display the fabric from which humankind has constructed a meaningful life. However, it's clearly not the museum itself that does this, but rather the individuals and groups that set out to collect, interpret and display aspects of earthly dwelling in the first place. A museum is merely the most suitable structural configuration for the organised classification, interpretation and display of human knowledge and experience at a given point in time, thereby highlighting that the world-making function of a museum is partial and incomplete, because it is based on what is known and knowable at any given time. By unpicking the relational threads of earthly dwelling, it's possible to uncover not only which people, events and things are valued, but also how value is determined and what consequences may ensue as a result. The final chapter brings everything together, or at least that was my intention when I wrote it, while at the same time acknowledging that the arguments made are incomplete. They're more like loose ends. So I refer to this chapter as a pause in the argument, an intermission, rather than a point of closure. This is so because the thinking upon which the book is based is ongoing. Thinking is never finished. It weaves about, stops and starts, and gets stuck down numerous blind alleys. Nevertheless, thinking is important because it opens us up to other ways of understanding what tourism does and why it matters. As such, looking beneath the surface of tourism is no different to thinking through other aspects of life, such as shopping, hunting for food, watching television, or living in a village. While Heidegger set my thinking in motion, understanding how tourism influences what being human might look and feel like requires a more experiential approach than that provided by Heidegger's rather obscure philosophical language, obscure to me anyway. What matters is how concepts help to illuminate lived experience by focusing on the practices and activities that are part and parcel of this experience. Likewise, criticisms of Heidegger's concept of dwelling as romantic and nostalgic are certainly well made, and Ingold has criticised his own dwelling perspective for conjuring up images of cosy, warm and comfortable existence. Yet for me, dwelling is an overarching concept. It's not a place in which to stay put. And as such, with the book, I wanted to liberate dwelling from what Ingold refers to as its aura of snug, well-wrapped localism. Dwelling can reveal a harsh and unyielding experience of being human in the world, in much the same way as a home can both be a place of refuge and a place to be feared. Overall, I use the book to argue that we should pay more attention to how the activity of tourism can shed light on the experience of being human. Ultimately, tourism is a way of being alive, and more attention needs to be given to how tourism shapes and reshapes the conditions of life and living. With the exception of chapter 3 and parts of chapter 2, which draw on past fieldwork of mine, the book offers a way of thinking about lived experience rather than narrative descriptions of lived experience. And future explorations of the arguments set out in the book, I think, should seek to address this gap. So hopefully I haven't battered everyone into submission by now. Over to Noel.
Yes, thank you very much. Go ahead, Noel.
Yes, thank you very much, Catherine, for this very elaborate. It's not a summary. It points to some of the main arguments you are making, and you also very cleverly already disarmed some of my criticisms that I wrote in the review. So that was very nice. But so it's my role as a reviewer here to also be critical, apart from lauding, which I also did in the review, because I think this is a very interesting book. It was very well written, and it offers a lot of food for thought. And the food for thought is very philosophical, and so it goes to the core of many of the questions that we are dealing with. And so that's why this book, I think, is it may be dealing with tourism, but tourism is just a lens to actually deal with much more profound questions. You started off talking about your book by positioning yourself, and I think it's also important that I position myself, and maybe that will also clarify why I was asked to review this book. I've also done quite a bit of research on tourism, and I've also been active internationally in quite a number of networks that deal with tourism, like the IUES Commission on the Anthropology of Tourism, the AAA Anthropology of Tourism Interest Group, and the EASA Anthropology and Mobility Network, which also covers a lot of tourism-related research. And so to continue reflecting and to start a dialogue with you first, and then later on also with the audience, I think that everything what I say needs to be also seen from the situation where we are currently in. And I think it's very important to realize that this book was written before COVID-19, and that I actually started reviewing it, or I definitely started reading the book also before COVID-19, and the review got published just in the midst of the whole pandemic. So, but I think this is quite important as a context to actually keep that in mind, because I'm sure, and maybe you can also talk about this later, that the way we look at this book and the way we reflect upon the issues now is different from what it was 3 years ago, because of COVID-19 and how that has maybe brought to light some issues, or maybe changed what people saw also in academia as a priority to be looked at. And so that brings me to the first thing that maybe I want to talk about, and this is also where you ended a little bit when, and it's your analytical lens. These two concepts, being and dwelling, which are in the way you use it, are also hard to separate, because dwelling as being in the world is of course indicating that being and dwelling are these two concepts that are interrelated. And one of the things that struck me at the time when I was reviewing the book, and again, so before COVID-19, was your choice for precisely these two concepts. Because definitely before COVID, what was very fashionable in academia were other concepts that by some are seen as opposites. So in terms, instead of being, a lot of research and focus on becoming. And so when we say becoming, we're situating ourselves in a very different philosophical tradition that also criticizes a lot of the philosophers that wrote about being. And of course, a lot of the research and the philosophizing on becoming comes after the philosophizing on being. So it's like a response to, and of course, it's situated in a different time period. And this I think is quite key, how a lot of the ideas and what we seem to be taken as important is of course always somehow a reaction also to the condition that we find ourselves in. And I think this is an interesting idea. And then as opposed to dwelling on, I'm saying as opposed to dwelling, some people see this as opposites, but they don't necessarily need to be, is everything that is related to mobility. And so there's a lot of research on mobilities. And so maybe this would be my first question, why you basically chose to look at tourism, which is one of your research interests, through this two concepts. What struck you as yeah, this is the lens to which I have to look at these things, and this will bring me to new insights?
I think for me, being human and dwelling gave me a lot more flexibility in terms of thinking through things. And that's why I adopted it really as the sort of overarching framework. But it's interesting what you say about becoming, being and becoming, because I toyed with all of that in the book, because I too kept thinking, well, people a lot of the time talk about becoming, because becoming sounds an awful lot more exciting than being. Somehow, yes, we're all becoming something, you know, much more interesting than we are. So I did spend a lot of time thinking about it. And the conclusion I came to, that for me, being and becoming are not either or. They are two sides of the same coin, if you like. And for example, when we go on holiday, I go away as an academic, for example, but I could choose on holiday to become anything else I want to be. People become alter egos when they're on holiday by pretending they're something they're not. And yet when they return home to be an academic or to be somebody who works in a shop. So being and becoming is not an either or for me. And I think to say that it's all about becoming, actually, it's not quite, it almost like cuts off half of your leg, if you like. You know, one leg's being and the other leg's becoming. And if you just call everything it's about becoming, somehow you're turning yourself into a one-legged person, because they are one and the same for me, or two sides of the same coin. Mobility is interesting. I did think a lot about mobility because it is a huge concept sociologically, and a huge concept in tourism in lots of different ways. And yet again, for me, mobility, I mean, it may sound obvious, but mobility is all about moving and being mobile. But sometimes we're not always moving and mobile. Sometimes we're standing still. So if everything is about mobility, then that is the overarching concept, that everything is almost like reduced to mobility. And I found it too restrictive for me. And I thought mobility is not the same as movement. And yet often when you look at a lot of the writings in mobility studies, it doesn't necessarily make that distinction. So I suppose the reason why I looked at being and dwelling is because of the freedom I felt it gave me to think a little bit more about being, becoming, mobility, and all of those core concepts that structure a lot of the tourism literature. So it's flexibility really is for me, it was more flexible.
So when you say, and this is also a little sentence that I had marked in your book, when you say that movement and mobility are not the same, can you clarify what is different?
Well, you can move around in your house, but that doesn't mean you are mobile in terms of being able to go to other countries. You may have economic reasons that stop you being mobile. You may have, sort of other reasons that stop you being mobile, but that doesn't mean you're not moving. So if everything is about mobility, for me, it implies that everybody is always going places. And sometimes people spend their entire lives living in their own town or their own, their own part of the world. They don't go anywhere else. So what does mobility mean for somebody who actually never goes outside of their own town or their own country? So I think that's why, for me, movement and mobility are not the same. I mean, I moved a house at the end of last year down to Devon, which is a very big tourist destination, the part where I moved to. And yet I've encountered people already who are not mobile in the sense that they never go out of Devon or they never go out of Cornwall. They always stay where they are. So I think when we talk about mobility, it gives the impression that everybody is mobile, but everybody isn't. And so with highlighting for me that mobility and movement are not necessarily the same thing, was my way of trying to think about some of the complexities underneath mobility, that it doesn't necessarily mean people are mobile.
And so what you are saying here, again, is very interesting when we look at it now that we have experienced the pandemic and lockdowns, because of course, before COVID-19, well, there was this this idea of that moving around is at least for the privileged ones is it goes seamlessly, you know. And then of course all of a sudden people are confronted with the fact that borders are closed and that it becomes a bit more difficult. But I find interesting in your book, and I clearly see that, so mobility is something that you struggle with, and you also clearly have an issue with the mobility scholars. And so one of the sentences that I marked also is that you write, my issue is that the mobilities paradigm in tourism scholarship privileges moving over feeling and thinking. Can you explain a little bit, or maybe elaborate what you mean by that?
Yes, I think what I was saying there, and I still do believe that, is that mobility almost like hides feeling, thinking, sensing, doing, all of those things, because it does tend to concentrate quite a lot on mobility and the sort of ways in which people become mobile. I mean, I'm not saying that mobility scholars and mobility studies do not talk about the emotions, because clearly they do. But I think, and you're right to highlight it, I struggled when I was thinking about it in the book, and I struggle to some extent now, because I just think that mobility sometimes becomes too focused on the mobileness. It doesn't take account of how people make decisions, how they think about what it's like to be mobile, or what it's like to move, or in actual fact, what it's like not to be able to move because people are prevented from moving. I mean, one of the things about tourism is that it is always talked about as being a mobile activity, and that the world is mobile. Tourists can go anywhere and everywhere, but clearly not everyone is a tourist. Not everyone has the ability to be mobile. You know, some people don't have the means, the economic means to be mobile. So I suppose what I would still say now is that the mobilities paradigm, yes, it's hugely significant, but for me, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable in terms of how it just tends to skate over or slightly make invisible things to do with emotions and embodiment and things like that. But I accept actually that even now I'm sort of rehearsing my own arguments again, if you like, because it's not something that I'm set in stone about. But I do sort of like to think a little bit more rather than just accept, oh yes, it's all about mobility. You know, well, is it?
It's very interesting what you are saying, because and of course you also acknowledge in your book that Tim Ingold has been one of the sources of inspiration. And when I'm thinking of his work, and of course he has written a lot about mobility, and he has his work predates the whole mobilities paradigm, because he started developing these ideas much earlier. And it's very interesting how, particularly in his later work, he's talking about dwelling, and how actually people also make dwellings and become aware of attachments through movement, and how it's actually hugely important, these movements through, and that actually in a lot of all the scholarship we have been too focused on the fixed and unchanged, but it's actually by moving through places and by engaging with people that come and go, that actually also identities or beings are being formed. And so exactly like you were saying before, that being and becoming are really hard to separate, but that in order to develop this idea of being, there's all these processes going on. And so that mobility does play a key issue. But I agree with you that it's then a conception of mobility that is far more complex than what we see in a lot of the tourism scholarship, where it's often limited to transport or people coming or going, and then mostly focused only on tourists. But I want to turn back to anthropology, and the fact that this is a particular work, and I also wrote in my review that many people these days, when they see that the new book in anthropology is coming out, they have an expectation that it is a particular book, and that it is an ethnography, or that it is based on ethnographic work. And this book is different, and you also explain that it is different. And so you place it within the tradition of philosophical anthropology. And I can tell you a little anecdote here. At my university, we have a research unit of philosophical anthropology, which is based in the Department of Philosophy. and these people have totally no contact whatsoever with the people who call themselves anthropologists and who are then social and cultural anthropologists, where actually there is this very strong link with ethnography and fieldwork. And we even require our students, because I'm in this Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, we require our students, our master students, to do fieldwork, because the idea behind seems to be that anthropology without fieldwork is not anthropology. And that brings us actually back again to Ingold, because Ingold has been one of the people who has written about this tension. And his argument very clearly is that anthropology and ethnography are different things. And I was wondering if you could also clarify how you position yourself in that debate.
Yes, I mean, you're certainly right. The book is not an ethnography. And my approach to philosophy, as I say in the book, is not about making abstractions from life and complicated concepts. I suppose I'm using philosophy as a way of thinking about things, because to my mind, being an anthropologist is about trying to look at the world as it is. It's not about trying to make it's trying to open up the world, if you like. And sometimes a lot of really conceptual philosophy, particularly with people like Heidegger, tends to hide life. You know, and as I said, when I was reading some of Heidegger, I was struggling to try and find an everyday example for what he was talking about. So I knew that kind of abstracting from life was not what I wanted to do. But I think anthropology is not all about ethnography. I mean, I think ethnography is hugely important and significant. It is what anthropologists do. But you don't always have to do ethnography. And thinking anthropologically doesn't always have to be done in relation to ethnography, because I think you can have ideas and thinking based on anthropology's view of trying to work out what's going on here. You know, what's happening in this cultural context? What are people thinking and doing? And I think you don't always have to approach that through ethnography. Although I do think, and I say this in the book, that what I would do next, if I was going to follow up on the book, is I would put together some kind of ethnographic project to try and tease out some of the cultural complexities and differences and similarities in some of the arguments that I've made in the book.
And having stated that, of course, in your 4 chapters, your 4 types of dwelling, there is actually, of course, there is a lot of ethnography, or you could call it autoethnography, because you do, of course, write about a lot of experiences and a lot of different places where you went to and how you analyze these. But I had a brief question about these 4 categories. How did you actually come to this categorization of these 4 types of dwelling, which to a certain extent are overlapping? Particularly the last one seems to be of like a different scale that also overlaps clearly with the 3 other ones.
Yes, I mean, it was difficult because when I was writing the book, I kept thinking, how am I going to actually make sense of all of this for myself, just as much as for somebody else who might read it? And as I've said about the tourism examples I've used, there is a whole load of things I could have chosen, I could have focused on. But when I was thinking about the sort of sensuous dwelling, architectural dwelling, for example, I chose them because I was thinking about them as being foundational aspects of the world in which we live in. So, for example, I thought it was impossible to write a book like this without talking about the body. Because if you're talking about how people engage with the world, it's not just a person or people, it's bodies. And the bodies then have, the mind and the senses and all of that. So the body had to be foundational to it. And then I chose the material kind of world, because the world is made of materiality. And that is a core part of engaging with the world, through the materiality of things, places, landscapes, those kinds of things. So materiality, I thought, had to be in there. And then building came about because, again, we build structures in which to live. We build structures in which to lock people up, you know, in prisons and things. So building is one of the ways in which we create the world that we want to live in. Although I'm accepting that people don't always have a lot of say in the world that's built, but building and buildings are a big part of how worlds are made. And also architecture is a huge attraction in tourism. You know, architecture attracts tourists. It's one of the, you know, the sort of key reasons why a lot of people travel. So I thought building and architecture had to be in it. And then I suppose finally I was thinking about earthly, because I liked the idea that that engaging with the world is about engaging with the earth. But it's not just about the earth in terms of the ground. It's all about what it is within the earth that we use to structure life. And that's how I came about to think of time, place, history, and memory as being these four reference. Because when I look at how people live, time and place and history and memory are shot through most aspects of life, and particularly most aspects of tourism, which is why I say in the book that tourism packages up time, place, history, and memory and sells it to people as particular packages. So there was a specific reason why I chose those. But then as I said earlier on, if I was writing the book again now, I would include virtual, you know, the virtual world, virtual reality, technology, if you like, in a very specific way. And I would pick out some of the areas where I've talked about non-humans, animals, plants, spirits, and I would make that a separate chapter as well. So I think, yeah. So to my mind, I made the decisions for good reasons, but looking back, you know, I acknowledge that there are big gaps there. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to write it again.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have to address that in other publications, I think.
Yeah. In the time that we have left, and before we open up the floor to questions, I want to turn explicitly to tourism, because we haven't talked directly about tourism yet. And of course, it's a very important part of the book. And actually, in my review, I also ask you questions. I actually pose questions in my review that I think would be nice to also talk about here. One of the things that I was wondering about, and I also asked this in the review, what exactly makes tourism special and different from other forms of travel? And you mentioned, and this was interesting in your presentation, you considered pilgrimage as a form of tourism. I'm not sure that everybody would agree with that. But so basically, what makes tourism special and different from other forms of travel in terms of experiences and being and dwelling? I was actually wondering if the book would be called Being and Dwelling Through Travel, how different would then the contents of the book be?
Yes, I mean, there is, as you know, there has been that constant discussion within tourism about tourism and travel, and being a tourist and being a traveller. And being a traveller sounds altogether more exciting than being a tourist, and sometimes a more ethically acceptable position than being a tourist. I mean, I think tourism is in one sense is special because it is one of the ways in which we encounter other people outside of our daily lives, other than our neighbours and friends and family, for example. So tourism takes us out of ourselves. So I think it's special from that point of view. But then having said that, I think tourism is also part of everyday life. And that's not to say that we are always on holiday, because clearly we're not. But even when we're not on holiday, a lot of people are thinking about going away. They're planning going away. They're looking at brochures or material or marketing or adverts and planning where they're going to go. So I think tourism is special for all those reasons, because it takes you out of yourself and you encounter other people in that way. And also it's something that a lot of people carry around in their heads with them. You know, as I said, thinking and planning about a holiday, we almost do it like second nature. And the amount of adverts you get on television now for going away, tourism is always there as part and parcel of everyday life, if you like. So it's special for me.
when you say that tourism is part of everyday life, I was thinking a lot, and I mentioned this in my review. Of course, many people on this planet at a certain point in their lives, and some people in many points of their life, play the role of a tourist, but oftentimes very limited in time. I mean, again, the privileged ones maybe have more time to play this role. But one of the things that I kind of found missing, and I would like you to reflect upon this, is of course when we are looking at tourism and how it makes people feel of, you know, of being alive or of being human. How does that work for the people who are actually much more confronted with tourism because they are working in tourism, and who are actually where tourism is a much more important part of their lives than the tourists who just play this role, you know, when they are on their holidays.
Yes, I mean, you're right, and there's lots of times in the book when I say that in talking about tourism, it's very exclusive, because there are certain people who can never travel for a whole load of reasons. And it's also not a pleasurable activity for everyone. For a lot of people, tourism is work, and not very pleasant work at that. And they don't necessarily have a choice, because they may work somewhere where the majority of the sort of economy of the country is derived from tourism. So there isn't a lot of choice in it. So I think tourism does sort of encapsulate an awful lot of the social and cultural challenges that people face in their lives, which I suppose is another way why I think it's special. And because of that, because tourism incorporates pleasure, it incorporates work, it incorporates things like pilgrimage, it brings people into a relationship with you know, systems of living and governing that are not the same as their own. So, for example, what might be considered illegal in this country or not legal in this country might be considered legal elsewhere. And so tourists can end up getting arrested inadvertently because they do something that wouldn't be a problem back home. So for me, when you think of some of the core things that anthropology is interested in, you know, things like work, play, faith, systems of government, regimes of punishment, tourism can illustrate all of those to a greater or lesser extent. And so that's why, for me, tourism can open up a lot of what it is to be alive, but that opening up is not always pleasant. It may be if you're the tourist having a nice time, but it may not be for the person who's working in the hotel, getting paid minimal wages, doesn't have any options and choice in the world. So I suppose what I'm saying is that I'm acknowledging that tourism isn't always pleasurable for everybody.
But even if I would focus only on the tourist and leave all the other actors involved in tourism aside, a lot of the examples, or actually all of the examples that you are describing, are the type of tourism that actually most of us academics also would engage in. It's the more cultured, more refined tourism. And of course, this is not the tourism that all tourists engage in. There's a lot of tourists who are not so much interested in these things and who just prefer, you know, a beach and sun holiday, where it's of course very different what they do and the kind of practices they engage in. And I was wondering, when I was reading your book and your analysis, how the practices of those tourists, how it helps them to, you know, to be alive and to be human.
Yes, I think it was David Lowenthal or somebody, I can't remember exactly who said that you know, you can traveling allows you to travel, you know, or thinking about traveling, you take your prejudices with you and your stereotypes with you, and just because you travel doesn't mean you actually engage with the places in which and the people that you travel to. And as we know, in tourism, there are sort of things, all-inclusive holidays, where people converge on a place, they stay for 2 weeks in one place, they want to eat familiar foods, they want to have a nice time, they don't really want to get to know local culture and beyond, you know, sort of cultural displays that are put on in hotels. They don't want to go further than that, and then they go home again. So in some ways, they take themselves out into somewhere else, but they come back as themselves. They don't always change, or they don't always learn from where they go and what they do. But even if that's the case, you know, going away for some people just reinforces their own worldview, their own way of thinking. And that could be, my way of living is more superior than yours, or I'm glad I don't live like that. But it does often reinforce somebody's way of thinking in the first place. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't interrogate what that thinking is and how they come to that view. It just acknowledges not everybody. Tourism is not a transformative experience for everybody who travels.
Mm-hmm. And your last answer creates a very nice bridge to the last point that I wanted to raise, and it's a point that I've become very much aware of because of my activities in international anthropological fora, where I'm confronted with anthropologies and anthropologists from all over the world. And it's an issue that is not particular to your book, but your book is also shows where some of the issues lie. When you were talking about, you know, perspectives and views, talking about tourists, I think we academics also have similar issues. And I was very glad in your book that you are very much aware of the fact that the examples that you are describing are coming from your world, and that, of course, and this is also what you said in your presentation, that in other places things may be very different. I think this is one thing that is very important. Of course, we cannot claim to have general universal insights when we only base examples on the places where we are based. This is one point, but I think another point is also this whole question that we are looking at these issues through theories and concepts that are all extremely Western centric. When you talk about anthropological or philosophical anthropology, it's basically Western philosophy. It would be very interesting actually to do this exercise and to, you know, to look at this through other philosophical lenses, like in Chinese philosophy. And I think that would also open up actually a lot of the discussions, because it's very interesting to see how, a lot of ideas are circulating, and it's always through the same lenses that we are looking at issues. And I think, the more we want to come to an understanding of how our world works, also this idea of not looking at how things are happening in other places, but also how can we look at also even our own experiences through other lenses and other things. I don't know what. Yeah,
I mean, yes, definitely, and clearly when I talk even about things like walking and seeing, it is a Western perspective of walking and seeing. And I remember quite a number of years ago now, I examined a PhD by a Chinese student who was looking at Chinese attitudes to travel and tourism, and the sort of Chinese philosophy that influenced Chinese understandings of what they are. And of course, that's absolutely fascinating, but it's not something I am able to sort of write about, because it's not my experience. But I certainly think there is a huge scope for asking other people in other cultures what they think. Does it look like this in your culture, or does it not? And if it doesn't, why doesn't it? What's interesting? And then, are there any similarities with the way you do things? So yes, I was very much aware that the book is a particular perspective, but I would love to read other cultures' views of how they understand what being alive means, because it's not the same for everybody.
Good. I think I will leave it here, and hopefully we have some. I see that there is already one question asked in the Q&A, but maybe there are other questions. So I propose that we open up the floor, and then we can include some others now.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating, and may I say, cordial discussion. It's always nice to have such a collegiality. For me, it's absolutely. I found myself, as I was listening to this extraordinarily interesting discussion, wondering how such a work would look like if one did it through the Turkish lens, you see. Now, the interesting thing about that is there is a word in Turkish which in there, as it were, that indigenously very closely maps onto tourism, I think in a very, very revealing way. I should take a step back and say, in Turkish culture generally, you always do something for a reason. Two, you always do something as part of a wider hierarchy, a wider social hierarchy, which legitimizes or simply permits what you're doing. So, for example, you might go and do something for a journey. Now, that journey would not be tourism because the journey is to do something which, as I say, which is authorized in some way, either by your senior relatives or by your employer or something like that. If you're a woman, there's been a lot of analysis, particularly by brilliant work by Carol Delaney, which many of you here will be familiar with, which shows how these things are very closely mapped onto a hierarchical sense of gender, which means women are more constrained to move around than men. Now, if you're going to go on a pilgrimage, again, that's a clearly defined activity, and you call that visiting. And again, there's been much anthropological description of that. So what about tourism? Well, as I said, there is an indigenous word that captures it beautifully, which is a simple verb, which is gezmek. And as you appreciate, it's very close to our gaze. I think that's just a coincidence. But basically, gezmek means to do something without requesting or needing authorization, simply for the pleasure of moving around the world. And when they say to someone, you're very, very fond of gezmek, when you're very fond of gezing, if you translate it with English gerund, what they mean by that is that you like simply being yourself and being able to move around without having to ask anybody any questions about whether or not you can do it or not. You can't just get on the plane and go. You can't just do this. And they would say to somebody in conversation, yes, he or she simply likes doing this. Now, translate that back into our discussion about what tourism is. And I'm wondering whether it is not astonishingly close. And I'm particularly in the light of what you've just been saying in your discussion, because it seems to me what we're really saying in leaving behind everyday life is that we're leaving behind the constraints and the social complexity and the social tension in everything that we do in our everyday lives, so embodied in complex meshes of power. But the moment we get out going through this ritual of these days so often of going through the airport, we can do what we want. We can spend 4 times the normal daily budget on a lunch and nobody bothers about it. We can buy a piece of trash which nobody is allowed to talk to us about because it's what we've done on holiday. You can go where you want. Tourists, by definition, can move from Rome to Madrid and nobody minds. And so you see, if we were then to write a book about tourism using this Turkish lens, you can see how beautifully it would divide up different forms of human movement. There will be a chapter on what I just described. There'll be another chapter on pilgrimage with its own context. There'll be another one on journeying with its context. Another one just simply who can do what, where, moving. So, you know, and that really almost inspires me to drop my current writing projects and oh, can I do this? But of course, other things stop in precisely because I'm not a tourist. I do have a job to do. But anyway, I don't know what you think. Well, Catherine, and also know what you think how a work might look that tries to use Turkish indigenous categories to understand tourism better. Is it at all helpful?
I think you should write that, David. Sounds fascinating to me. But it's also interesting because it highlights how you know, tourism is about this sort of balance between obligation and freedom. You know, the obligation to go to work and earn a living and the freedom that supposedly comes from tourism. But of course, what obligation and freedom mean is culturally specific. It depends on how it manifests itself in a particular society. So looking at how, for example, Turkish understandings of travel and tourism would be fascinating because of that, because it would not only shine a light on Turkish culture and Turkish ways of thinking, but it would also, in a way, help to flesh out the differences between the sort of non-Turkish tourist who goes to Turkey on holiday and the sort of the Turkish people who provide the tourist destination and everything that tourists do, because there's clearly a lot of times no meeting of minds. There's like the Turkish world that happens over here providing the destination, and the tourists coming to that destination, and almost like going along in parallel lines with never the two shall meet. And so I think all of that would be revealed by looking at non-Western forms of tourism and travel, if you like. So you should write it.
Indeed, and the other thing that strikes me is the obverse of that is there is none of that kind of faint censoriousness that divides our discussion between tourists who travel with the ability for self-learning from the touristic process, and those who simply don't want to. They simply want to relax. That category just doesn't exist in the Turkish consciousness. If you are free to gaze around as you wish to, and you go away, that's fine. That's up to you. Whether or not you go to learn Greek or whether you go to drink Retsina simply doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It simply doesn't form that part of that cultural consciousness. And so there is no problem at all if somebody just wants to go there to the hotel and stay in the hotel for 4 weeks, except you might complain from the economic point of view. But there's no emotional, as I say, or cultural baggage associated with that.
Yeah.
Of course, there are many other ways that they might express learning, but it's not in that context.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say anything, Noel, before we turn to
I actually want to react, because what you are proposing, David, is actually very interesting, and I think it is key to actually have other concepts and apply them, not to understand in this case the Turkish context, but to understand all forms of tourism and travel, including our own, because we are forcing scholars from all over the world to actually use Western concepts, and this is so limiting. So it's actually very interesting to use other concepts. Actually, a couple of years ago, I organized a panel at an IUES Congress in Japan, and the panel was all about non-English concepts that are used in different countries, including Japan, to talk about tourism. And it was very frustrating because so many people, I mean, our theories and our frameworks, our Western frameworks, are so dominant that a lot of people around the world are using these frameworks. So they are not even always immediately aware of the fact that in their own languages and in their own academic traditions, there may also be concepts that are very useful as lenses to actually look at issues. And so I think this is hugely important.
I wonder what it would look like in sending in journal articles to journals that are very Western centric. You know, I wonder what reviewers would think of that. I mean, I would find it fascinating, but I wonder if it's more difficult to get things published because people are not aware of those concepts, which is not a good thing, I would say.
Maybe, but the example you gave of a Chinese scholar, if she wrote her article to explain the Chinese understanding of movement, I would hope that would get a sympathetic reading. Was her understanding very diverse?
It was, as I remember. I mean, it's quite a number of years ago now, but I found the whole thing fascinating because it introduced me to a world that is not my experience. And I did hope that that it would be published, but I don't think it has been published. But whatever.
I see. Well, please do fire your questions in. We've got 3 already, and I think with this system we can get people can sometimes ask their question live, but we don't see them, as it were, as a kind of a radio. So if anybody would like to ask their question live, I think if you put your hand up in the normal way, virtually, I think it should bring you to the top of the screen. And unless I've misunderstood the system, at the moment there are no virtual hands up. So let's go to the first question from Paul Kervenberg, who says, how do you think dwelling relates to the other view in science, the view of social construction? I'm asking as I'm studying pilgrimage in relation to landscape and experience of landscape where these different views keep popping up and seem to be competing. I don't know, Catherine, you'd like to comment, and Noel, or both of you, on this question.
So how does dwelling relate to social construction? Is that the question? How does?
Yes, yes. How does dwelling relate to the view of social construction?
Well, I suppose I would answer that by saying that in the book I talk about how dwelling is always a dwelling in relation to the social and the cultural, and so there was an element of construction about it. because cultures are constructed through the way people engage with the world around them. But they're not always constructed, because people challenge things. They decide they don't want to go down particular routes. And so I don't see dwelling as being a fixed thing, whereas sometimes social constructionism does, to me anyway, does imply that things are slightly fixed. I see it as being something that's more mobile and fluid. And again, as I said earlier, which is one of the reasons why I chose dwelling, because to me, it was more flexible than some other concepts like social constructionism, for example, or the social construction of the world. Don't know if that's a very good answer, but.
Yeah, I think the confusion comes from the fact that dwelling is a concept that is used in many different ways, and it is often used in a more fixed way. And then when I think of dwelling, I think immediately also about the literature on place attachment, and that of course it creates all kind of imaginaries of fixity.
Yeah.
And there are other concepts of dwelling, like you are pointing out, that are much more flexible and relational.
There we are. Thank you very much. Don't forget to fire your questions in. So we now go to Muruska. I won't try and pronounce your surname. I'm afraid I'm not quite experienced how to pronounce that. But it says, to what extent do you think your approach in the book could be useful in an analysis of migrants making trips to their homelands? And the ability or inability of your approach to create insights into diverse experience and motivations, such as going across to care for kin, going on a pilgrimage, visiting museums and beaches, and so on.
No, I think it would be very, very useful to sort of, instead of taking some of the examples I chose, airports and what have you, to think about it in terms of migrants going back, or things like roots tourism, for example, to think about what it is about those aspects of tourism. What do they reveal about our engagement with the world? Because clearly a migrant's experience is totally different to that of someone who's spent all their life in the same place and hasn't either been forced to move somewhere else or chosen to move somewhere else. So I think particularly a lot of what I say in the book, you can apply it to different concepts. I think it just requires a thinking through of what some of the issues are in order to highlight what it is about, sort of people traveling back to their home country, for example. What is it about that experience? What does that experience tell us about that particular world in which they live? So I would say, yes, you can apply it to other circumstances.
I think if I may chip in also, I think what the question is also hinting at, and I find it a very interesting one, is when we're thinking about migration and dwelling, then the question, of course, is dwelling where, and are there multiple dwellings? Because Catherine, you were talking about people going back. So the assumption that going back, but going back where? Homelands, and this idea of home, and maybe also multiple homes. And of course, when we are talking about dwelling, and this is something that we haven't talked about, but which you also mentioned in your book, in the last form of dwelling, the element of time. This is a very important one when we are talking about migration. When people migrate to a certain place, they leave behind what was their original home. But when they return, that home has changed. They have changed, the home has changed, the people have changed. And so it somehow creates all kind of tensions, and sometimes also disappointments, because it's this idea of reconnecting and then seeing, but things have changed. And of course, the longer you have been away, the more difficult it becomes to find the dwelling that maybe people are looking after.
Yeah, but then I suppose I'd also say that migration is not tourism. Migration is a different thing altogether. Tourism.
But in the example, she's talking about migrants who actually live in a certain place and who may go to their countries of origin as tourists. And you could, of course, argue whether they are tourists or not, but to a certain extent, they are visiting friends and relatives, but sometimes also going to places in their countries of origin, sometimes also places they haven't been to. So there is certainly an element of tourism involved, I would say.
And sometimes when you travel back somewhere, you've been so influenced by the world in which you've been living in, that actually going back doesn't look as familiar anymore. You start to notice things that are different, and maybe to feel more or less comfortable by going back, because it may not be who you are anymore, or it may be somewhere that you wished you never left, you know, so.
And it points also to another issue, but that brings us back to mobility and immobility. It's very interesting how migrants are people whose identity is defined by movement. I mean, the migration etymologically refers to the movement. And this is very interesting because, of course, for most migrants, they don't want this movement to be all that important. They basically want to go somewhere and then work, or, you know, live a life and then maybe go back or maybe stay. But it's very interesting how their identity is predicated on a movement, and how actually there's also an expectation that if a migrant wants to be good, then a migrant should not be too mobile, because there's this whole issue of integration, you know. And so that's why we don't often think, and also in scholarship, we don't often consider the mobilities of migrants, including tourism.
Indeed, the old English saying, "A rolling stone gathers no moss," it used to puzzle me when I was a child so much, but I now appreciate what that old folks say meant. Well, again, please do fire your questions in. I can see very familiar colleagues in the audience. I don't know whether, if Hazel, you're still here, you would like to ask something, or Gary, Marvin, or Hilary, you're most welcome to do so if you'd like to. But perhaps just whilst you're thinking about that, the interesting thing is, Catherine, you occasionally used words which were drawn from Bourdieu without perhaps mentioning him very explicitly.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you could have written the book simply using Bourdieu. Did you need the Hegelian side? Where did he take you that Bourdieu could not reach? I think.
Well, I suppose Heidegger gave me a way into thinking about what it feels like. And I know what you mean, Bourdieu and habitus, and also Mauss and habitus originally came that way. But I just didn't think it's enough on its own, I suppose. But clearly Bourdieu is there. I mentioned him and discuss him in the book quite a lot, particularly in terms of this idea of a tourist habitus. But just on his own, I just thought it wasn't enough for me, because it's not just about habitus, it's not just about the body. It's about all sorts of other things as well. And so as important as he is, he was important in a very defined way. So I controlled him, if you like, David. I put him in a place, is where I put him.
I see. And what do you think, Noel, about the place of Bourdieu in this kind of discussion?
Yes, there is definitely, there's a bit of Bourdieu in it, but I think Bourdieu is not so useful when it comes indeed to the body, and even less when it comes to the moving body. So there the phenomenological approach, of course, offers much more interesting things. But I think we need, of course, a combination of both. What Bourdieu does, and that's very good, is of course point at the structures, the structures that determine our lives. And this is also very clear when we are talking about tourism. There is, of course, the importance of the personal experience, and this is, of course, where the phenomenological approach does a very good job at feeling emotions, personal experience, but it leaves out that these experiences are embedded in social structures. And this is, of course, where then an author like Bourdieu would come in really handy, because it points out that everything we do is to a certain extent determined. Bourdieu has, of course, written very nicely about how also even the kind of tourism that we engage in is predicated on the social class we belong or want to belong to. And that also explains why a lot of scholars who study tourism, they don't study mass tourism because they despise it, because they don't want to be mass tourists. And so that's why there is a very skewed knowledge about tourism that is very much focused on cultural tourism and on these more alternative forms of tourism, which is the type of tourism that academics like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether there any of the Turkish experts in our, the tourism experts in our audience would like to comment on that, because I certainly remember when the tourism committee of the REI was founded, I was absolutely astonished to learn that that unless I've completely misremembered, that something like 10% of the world's economy is associated with tourism. I mean, it's an absolutely astonishing figure. And indeed, when we've organized panels on tourism, they've often been amongst the most popular of any big conference that we have. So clearly it's a phenomenon that we've, perhaps for that reason, we've neglected, but it's obviously integral to any way that we approach the modern world.
It's very interesting responding to that quickly, that I just had a look at, because in the summer there will be the IASA conference in Belfast, and had a quick look at the panels, and it's very interesting to see that there is virtually nothing on tourism, which of course is very much related to the fact that COVID-19, not many people have traveled, and also not many people have been able to do research on tourism. So it's, yeah.
It's interesting also that given the size and the scale and the scope of tourism, how it has suffered, as those of us who sort of focus on it, it has suffered for decades over being not taken seriously as a subject of anthropological academic interest, because it's almost a bit frivolous and it's not very serious, and it's not really a serious topic for an anthropologist to look at. But tourism is a microcosm of the world, worlds, people, cultures, and everything is in tourism. And so it seems to me slightly weird that it's doesn't get a greater attention sometimes in some of the core anthropological conferences. It's not really, it doesn't always have a place, I think. But to me, that has always seemed a bit odd.
Yes, well, of course, looked at it superficially, of course. The tourists don't stay still. You can't look at the way that their ritual merges with their religion, which merges with the kinship in their traditional anthropological way. Of course, you can when you think about it for a bit, but I certainly see why on the surface that would be a particular difficulty. Well, we've got a couple more questions here. Just someone's asked for a clarification of the term I used. Yes, briefly, it's Gezmek, G-E-Z-M-E-K, if you want to look it up. So that's Gezmek. But moving along, Mariuszka had a follow-up question before we get to Hazel's question, for which thank you very much. So Mariuszka says, following upon my question, what is also important is the potential emotional and moral tensions between using holiday time to perform kin work, I suppose, looking after kin in the homeland, and the wish to be a tourist, having time for oneself. Yes, exactly. So if you're, in other words, if you're a migrant somewhere and you've got 4 weeks leave a year, do you use that to look after your aged parents, or do you use that to do something else? A terrible dilemma, but please, what do you think, our panelists, about that?
Well, that's also about the value, isn't it, that you attach to activities in life. And as I said before, it's this almost like this tension between the obligation that I have to engage or look after relatives and the freedom that I want to go off and do what I like. And that mirrors sort of obligations and the tension between obligation and freedom that we find in life generally. So I think even going back where you have to look after family and friends and then feeling that tension that actually you just want to go out and have a nice time, you know, mirrors the sort of obligations that you have within everyday life, I would say. But you can still fit tourism in with obligations in just the same way as people talk about business travel also incorporating a tourist element to it, because at the same time as conducting business, people go, which is the obligation, at the same time people go off and have a nice time. Again, I don't know if that's answered it very well, but
it's the contrast between the freedom of, if tourism is freedom, you have to do what you want. Please, Noel, sorry.
No, sorry. I was thinking of having time for oneself as being a very Western interpretation of what is important in tourism, because of course in other cultures it's not about having time for oneself, but it's also spending a lot of time with relatives. That's why you have and this is a trend actually in tourism. They call it this intergenerational tourism, where actually you go on holidays with different generations of your family, you know, grandparents, parents, children. And so it's all about spending time. And so sometimes that also involves actually an element of caring. But on the other hand, and this also explains why in Western countries, the idea of city trips are so important, and city trips that are done with small groups of friends, where actually you don't go with your relatives, but you go with your friends to really have time to spend and do the things that you like without having to take care of your children. And so, yeah, there are different priorities there that play, I think.
I mean, that's one of the interesting things that Marushka's question highlighted, is that what does tourism look like in different cultures? Is it about time for myself and it's all about me, or is it actually about spending time with relatives and doing things with relatives? And so how we define and understand tourism is culturally specific, and it doesn't look the same for everybody.
Well, thank you. And now we come to Hazel's question, for which thank you very much. Hazel says, yes, thinking about this distinction between mass tourism and more snobbish forms of tourism, Hazel says there are quite a few examples of mass tourism, which surely is cultural, which has been written in the work, as she mentions, Handforth, Celia Marnie, Butcher, Weinecker, David Harrison, and Richard Sharpley. But she says we also need to think about the relationship between the individual and the mass. Well, two kind of separate questions here. Should we look at both of them?
Yes, I mean, mass tourism is a sort of generic term, and mass tourism can be cultural, it can be sport tourism, it can be anything. It's about the numbers traveling at any particular time. Although mass tourism does tend to get associated with what would be, for some people, classed as a typical type of holiday, sun, sea and sand, and is taking place at very specific times of the year, which for, sort of Western tourists is usually, the main holiday season in the UK, for example, would be around the summer months. And mass tourism is also associated with being a more destructive type of tourism because of the numbers and what have you. So I think, yes, Hazel's right, mass tourism can be thought of as cultural tourism. Yeah, and I slightly forgotten what the question was now.
About the relationship between the individual and the mass.
Oh, yes.
Or also about the relationship between mass tourism and cultural learning or experiencing.
Yeah, well, one of the arguments about mass tourism has always been that it doesn't lead to any cultural learning, because people travel en masse, they go to all-inclusive holidays, and they just, they're not really interested in learning anything about the culture. So mass tourism has always been criticised for that. But in terms of individual forms of travel, I would suggest tend to give people more freedom to explore than mass tourism always does. Mass tourism is very controlled. And whereas individual tourism, even though sometimes it might be an illusion, allows people the freedom to go out and to look at things. It doesn't mean that someone will like what they see or even understand what they see, but there is an element that individual tourism is a slightly freer sense of tourism. Although, as I've said, sometimes that is more of an illusion, because you're still controlled by transport systems, accommodation networks, and all the sort of paraphernalia that enables tourism to happen.
Yeah, I think mass tourism is a problematic concept, and it's actually interesting how it is being used less and less, and how now people speak a lot about over tourism, which is of course not replacing mass tourism, because it's pointing at problems. But there is this association that masses and so numbers, that is a bad thing. And so the association that mass tourism is bad. And that's why you have all these alternative forms of tourism, which are not mass and which are done by definition good. And of course, this is definitely not the case. There are some forms of mass tourism are actually more sustainable than some more alternative forms of tourism. And I talked before about academics also engaging in other forms of tourism, which are not necessarily, and I certainly agree that there are forms of mass tourism that are cultural, but I think there is this association that other forms of tourism can be, and that mass tourism is not cultured, and so that it is less refined. And so there's this whole idea of class playing and looking down upon masses, and so this whole all these problematic associations that people make with mass tourism, whereas of course many people don't necessarily choose for mass tourism, or they are choosing because it's cheaper, not because they necessarily like it. I mean, there's all kind of reasons why people engage, but it is quite a problematic term. But
yeah.
The second point about the relationship of the individual in the mass is of course a very interesting one, and again, it's one that in different parts of the world and in different social and cultural groups would be very different. I actually traveled with a group of Japanese to Indonesia, and I must say it was an extremely interesting experience, because there the individual in the mass is very different than what we would see. I mean, this idea of really the group being so important and not doing anything to, you know, to create tensions within the group, whereas in a lot of European forms of travel, even within mass forms of tourism, there's much more attention also to the individual, and you know, some freedom given within the structured formats.
But I suppose in a way, it also, mass tourism is highly structured, because a lot of people are going away in a very short period of time altogether, and therefore there has to be huge amounts of structure and control, and trying to be an individual within that isn't easy. You know, it isn't, because you can almost like get swept along by what's happening in a particular place.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have a question here from Vivian Gurnick. Thank you very much indeed. And she says, I found your work, Catherine, on heritage, place and identity useful. I'm currently thinking my way through the idea of mobile tourists immobilizing heritage narratives. Yes, I suppose what that possibly means is the way that you have to create heritage narratives for the tourists to consume in modern parlance. But maybe there are other interpretations of that comment as well. I like this idea of dwelling as a new perspective for me to explore. Is mobility and dwelling an opposite, or are there ways that they can complement each other in terms of our use of the categories? Well, there we are.
I mean, I think clearly mobility complements. I think it's not an either or. And I suppose the way I talk about mobility in the book is because I just don't feel comfortable with it as an overarching sort of concept. But that doesn't mean to say it doesn't have, clearly it has huge value. And looking at mobility or mobileness or movement in relation to heritage, and how heritage stories become mobilized, if you like, as a politically mobilized, culturally mobilized, all those sorts of things, is actually quite, I would say, is quite an interesting way of thinking about it, because heritage is the mobilization of history, if you like, isn't it, in order to tell a particular story. So there is certainly a connection between mobility and heritage that goes beyond moving people to heritage places. It's for me, it's about the mobilization of history for particular purposes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We could argue that nationalism is the great creative heritage. I think that would be the conventional view, and I'm surely that's the case. You can see that in any emergent nationalist movement. For example, Quebec. I mean, if you look at the Visitors Centre in Quebec, I mean, that's an example of an astoundingly simplified heritage created for mass tourists, which is astonishing that that's put forward as a serious museum. Of course, that's where nationalism and tourism can coincide. But it's a fascinating point. I wonder whether mass tourism has done more to create these simplified narratives than nationalism has. I don't know whether that's the case. Maybe it's even more powerful than nationalism, in other words. What do you think?
I don't know whether I don't know whether that's the case, but certainly tourism, and I wouldn't just say it's not just mass tourism. All tourism condenses presents a condensed view of the world, because you know, people can only take in so much, and if you're selling a tourism package or a tourism experience, you have to sort of grab people's attention really quickly, and therefore cultures are mobilized as a way of marketing and advertising places and people, and only certain elements of a culture are mobilized, because tourists by very nature don't have a lot of time to make a decision. I think it was Kathleen Adams who famously referred to travel agents as brokers of ethnicity, because the tourist who doesn't have a lot of time to think about where they're going to go just uses these markers, if you like, as a way of deciding where to go. Oh, that sounds attractive, I'll go there. And of course, that's a very distorted view of people and a very distorted view of cultures and places.
Yeah, I think that the question that is asked here is pointing also to something else, but it's related. The idea that tourism, and I wouldn't only talk about tourists, but tourism and all the actors involved in tourism have or can have the effects that heritage and the stories that are being told about places and about people render also these places and people like as frozen in time, because there are certain imaginaries that circulate within tourism and that create expectations. And so that means that when tourists go to certain places, they expect to be places like like the advertisement or the images that have been sold to them.
Yeah.
So that creates then this danger that things are not allowed to change because it doesn't fit the imaginary that circulates within tourism. But it's not only, of course, tourists, it's all the other actors involved in tourism that play a role in this.
I wonder where the internal tourism works there, where people, for example, the idea of building cities which reflect, for example, European culture in China to visit. That seems, I don't know. What do you think? Is this creation of some sort of internal virtual reality, which, of course, it brings us to the point that what book you would write if you were going to be writing about virtual realities rather than, as it were, real realities.
Yeah, I haven't got to the virtual reality yet. Hopefully that'll be a chapter in Hazel's and Leslie's book.
I see.
But it's certainly fascinating. And what brought to mind then when you were talking is about Las Vegas, of course, because Las Vegas has the pyramids, as well as lots of other, sort of major cultural attractions. And so even somewhere like Las Vegas is a fascinating place, totally socially constructed, totally, sort of not just borrowing from, but stealing, like other ways of other markers of distinctiveness, which is what one of the things that culture is. It's distinctive, and sort of plonking it down in the middle of a desert, and somehow people can go to Las Vegas and think, well, I've done Egypt then because I've seen the pyramids. So of course it gives a very false view of the world, but then I suppose that's the whole reason for Las Vegas. It's designed to entice you into spending money, and therefore it has to create this weirdly unreal world, so that it makes people think that it's okay to lose lots of money.
Exactly. I don't know what would you like to make a comment there?
Yes, the Chinese example is a very interesting one in light of the discussion we are having about dwelling and tourism, because a lot of these Chinese examples are not only places that Chinese people visit, but it's also places that Chinese people live in. So they create little Venices or little Parises of little German or Dutch villages or what have you not. And so these are copies, replicas of existing places in Europe. And to us, it all seems kitsch and inauthentic and what have you not. But of course, from an Asian perspective, to copy is to show actually how much you respect the original and how much you actually value it. And so it's a very interesting one, how they create or recreate these places, not just to visit, but also to actually live in. It's like living in, yeah.
Yes,
like,
imitation is a form of respect, isn't it? And to imitate something is significant. It's not seen as a negative. It's a huge positive. Yeah.
That's why if your student plagiarizes your work, it's a form of respect.
I should remember that then. I must have been respected a lot over the years then.
Well, we have a new question here from someone who'd rather not give their name, so from Anonymous, but a very good question, which is, could you talk about the methodological challenges involved in studying the experiences of tourists ethnographically, since they are not bound to one place? So there we are. How would you advise somebody to do ethnographic fieldwork in tourism?
Well, I suppose it depends. First of all, you'd have to know what it is that somebody's, you know, wanting to investigate. But just because something isn't fixed doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to investigate it ethnographically. Because, and one of the examples that I've talked about before, but not in the book, is that when I was doing some research at places like Hever Castle and Chartwell, which of course is Winston Churchill's home, you're not dealing with a fixed community. You're not in a village where you have the same sorts of, you know, the same people who are there, and therefore you're encountering those people and engaging with village life, because by the very nature of it being an attraction, people come and go all the time, and they're different people. They're not the same people. So I think it does pose interesting methodological issues in terms of how do you make meaning out of what you are seeing, if you like, what you're observing, when the people you're observing are always changing, constantly changing. But I don't think that doesn't mean to say you can't investigate it. And for example, I would use the same sorts of methods that anthropologists will use. You're still watching and observing. You're still talking to people. You're still asking yourself what is going on here. Those same kind of sort of ethnographic questions, if you like. It just happens to be a different kind of environment in which you're operating. So I suppose what I'm saying is it's a challenge in the sense you're not dealing with a fixed entity. And I'm not saying that a village is a fixed entity, because clearly people come in and out of a village. But it's not the same as tourism and tourist attractions, destinations and attractions, where there is a turnover of people. And so I suppose one of the challenges is that central one sometimes about, you know, how do I know that I've got enough? How do I know that I'm seeing everything that there is to see, if you like? At what point do I stop looking because I think I've got enough in order to make an interesting analysis? So I suppose it's knowing when to stop would be one of the methodological challenges. Yes, because the nature of tourism changes all the time.
Yes, there's always somebody constant, isn't there, and somebody moving. Well, not nearly always, anyway. Yeah. You know, one can imagine a pilgrimage site where there are millions of tourists, but there are 40 or 50 local families or businesses that run the process of the people coming. So you've got people organizing the flow of the tourists, and many of the questions that come up, no doubt, would fall into the street patterns. So that would be. But Noel, what do you think about the methodological challenges of?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. I want to start by saying that it's very important when we want to understand tourism that we stop focusing only on tourists. There's a lot of research on tourism, and it's interesting how many people confound tourism studies with tourist studies. And of course, if you want to understand tourism, we have to pay attention to all the actors that are involved. But even if we focus only on tourists, of course, how to deal with the research, a method is only a way to get to the answer of the research question. So it all depends on what you are particularly interested in. And it's not because tourists are on the move that you as a researcher need to be on the move. That could be a choice, but you can also look at tourists by staying put at one place and observe all the tourists coming and going. I mean, that's another way. And so another alternative is to follow the tourists or follow the guides or follow. I mean, it really depends on your research question, how you deal with it. And the research question is, of course, often informed by also the resources and the time that you have. Because if you want to follow tourists around, you need a much bigger budget, of course, and you need to have access. Yeah.
And I suppose it also is methodologically challenging in tourist destinations and tourist attractions, because as you said, Noel, where do you sit or stand and watch? Because there's so many entrances and exits, there's so many activities going on. You know, if you're looking at somewhere like Hever Castle, it's a huge, it's not just a castle. You know, people come and they don't ever go to the castle. They play archery in the gardens. They take part in exhibitions. They go sailing on the lake. They get married there. So how do you know what to look out for, and how do you know how long to spend looking at what it is you're looking at? And so capturing certain places is not easy. And one of the ways in which I think, well, certainly one of the ways in which I did this, I mapped out what it was I was looking at. I created a map for myself of this place, and I mapped out what was available to tourists. Where could they go? What could they do that involved things like, you know, archery, or going to the cafeteria and having lunch. And I would pick what I thought to be the most important places, or most of the places that tourists went to, and that would be one of the ways in which I would organise how to investigate a particular site. And you could do the same at a destination. You know, what is involved in that destination? What does it offer? Where do people go? But I think mapping out activity is one way of approaching the methodological issue of how do you go about it.
Yes, and we are approaching the question here from the traditional point of view of the anthropologist conducting independent research on a certain topic. But of course, you could envision as well doing research with a group of researchers that focus on different aspects and are positioned in different places, do different things. That would be very interesting. And of course, these days, apart from the methodologies that we always use, participant observation and interviews, there's a lot of technologies that we can use and that are being used when we look at tourism. There's tracking devices, there is cameras that can be placed in different places and that can capture all kinds of things. So there's a lot of technological aids also that can help us to capture things that before were harder to capture.
And of course, using different researches is really valuable, particularly if those researchers are different genders, come from different cultural backgrounds, different nationalities, different experiences and understandings of tourism, because then by its very nature, you would assume they would look and see and notice different things and maybe ask different questions. But it's not always possible to do that.
Well, we've sadly time for only one more question, because we don't go over time on these things. But there's a very interesting one from Gary Marvin, who basically says, are we being too Panglossian about this? What about the negative sides of tourism? And he quotes Venice here, particularly as we're talking about dwelling and being. I mean, he points out that people can simply no longer dwell in Venice, at least in the conventional sense of the word. So how can we, what can we do about that? I mean, should we, as tourism anthropologists, should we then become fighters for Venice and almost be against the very phenomenon that we're studying? And you've got 1.5 minutes each maximum to deal with this. So why don't you go first, Catherine? Yes.
Yes, absolutely. There are lots of negatives about tourism, and Venice is really interesting because there's a lot of stuff about cruise ships going to Venice and being so huge they dwarf, everything there is about Venice. I think looking at those negative sides of tourism, you would need to ask different questions. And they would certainly, I think, show you a different understanding of what it was to dwell through tourism if you are someone who is trying to live in Venice, for example.
Yes, and it's an interesting
question. Absolutely, go ahead.
Yeah, it's an interesting question right now because before COVID-19, there was a huge problem in Venice and there was a lot of complaints. But actually now Venice is begging for tourists to please come back. Because and so it shows the dependency on tourism, but the issue of Venice points also to the fact that tourism is embedded in other issues like housing market, and that brings us again to the issue of dwelling in another way that we don't have time to unpack here. But it points to the fact that this has been a very interesting discussion that we need to continue elsewhere since our time is up.
Well, thank you very much indeed to our discussant. Thank you very much indeed to our author for being so kind to be with us. I thank you very much to audience for your questions. And finally, I leave the floor to Ted Goodliff and to Haneen. Ted, if you're still here, you might just want to remind people what the next session is, and then Haneen can shut us all down. So thank you very much, and it's good night from me.
Yes, it's on March 17th at 2 o'clock. Earlier time because one of the speakers is from Vladivostok, which I think is a first. and it's Professor Fabrizio Fenghi's book, It Will Be Fun and Terrifying, Nationalism and Protest in Post-Soviet Russia. So I hope to see lots of you there. Janine?
Yes, the the last words end with me, and I want to thank you everybody for coming in the audience. It was lovely to have you all, even though we couldn't see you. So thank you for saying hi in the chat, and thank you, of course, to Catherine and Noel. And I hope you all have a lovely evening. I'm going to close the event now.
Bye.
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 Bye.